Well, Lent is finally here, and we're finally getting ready for Easter. Lent is the season in the church where we start on Ash Wednesday and we remember our mortality and our brokenness sometimes, and then we run all the way to Easter morning when we remember hope and resurrection. And Lent is this season for Christians of preparation. It's a time that we get ready to celebrate this big thing on Easter morning. Now, I don't know what your traditions were in your house growing up, but in my house on Easter morning, it looked a lot of times like this. We'd get up way too stinking early in the morning because sometimes my parents like to go to the sunrise service. Anybody like sunrise services? Yeah, I don't see as many hands for that amongst the younger crowd, all right? I love that some of you like it. I didn't see any kids' hands go up. I love it. Lent is here. No, sunrise services are great because it's a great way to start and remember the hope that comes with the sunrise. It is a beautiful thing. But as a kid, I wasn't crazy about it. So we get up way too early and we'd dress up in these nice new clothes. Sometimes we dress up in like pastel colors. Anybody do the pastel colors thing? And then we go to church. And then we come home and in our nice pastel, bright colored, clean clothes, we'd go looking for Easter eggs all over the house, which might mean that sometimes we were like crawling through dirt and, getting our nice, clean, pastel-colored clothes all dirty as we were scrambling and competing and fighting for Easter eggs. Anybody else think that we have the worst color combination to activity combination possible on Easter morning? But then we'd finish out with a big meal. And we'd gather everybody around this big table that my parents have. And we'd all kind of like cram in. And when we were kids, it was pretty easy because I have one sister who's older than me and then, my parents. And so there'd be four of us and we had four matching chairs and it was great. But then we started to add more and more people to the table. And so we started to bring in kind of like mismatched chairs. And now we're at the point where there's so many people, my grandparents and everybody else around this table that they raid the house for all the seating they can find. Dad normally gets stuck in this like recliner thing at kind of an angle. My sisters are on the corners, and so they're like reaching as far forward as they can to get to the dinner table. We're just cramming everybody into this table so everybody can have a seat at the table. Now, it gets so packed that pretty quick, once you get in to start the meal, nobody can get back out because you'd have to, get everybody out of the table again. And so my seat always conveniently is right in the middle of the table, which means when it comes time to, like clean up and put away dishes and everything else, I can't get out. It's unfortunate. Oh, no. But we've done everything we can to make sure that everybody has space at the table. A few years ago, my parents started taking this table, and the table's big enough, but the room's not. And so now they turn it kind of diagonal. And like most of the table is in the dining room, but a little bit of it's like spilled over into the hallway. Just whatever it's going to take to make sure that everybody has a seat at the table. Some of you know what that's like. That big holiday table with family and friends and meals. Even when I lived far away from home, like when I was in Dallas for seminary, it was nice to know that there was still, if I'd wanted it, a space at that table. Even when I couldn't come back, to know that it was still here if I'd needed it or if I'd wanted it, that there was still an offer for a space at the table. Some of our best experiences happen around tables like that. Some of you have memories around tables like this. As humans, that's how it goes, right? Whether it's a quick breakfast with friends or whether it's the glory of Thanksgiving dinner. We gather around tables and we share food and memories and stories. And we spend time with our loved ones. It's great to be around a table. But sometimes tables can be painful too. See, sometimes we look around at a table that used to be so full and it's a little more empty. And there's an empty seat where a loved one used to sit. Sometimes we look around at a table and we realize that there's no space for us. There's space for everybody else, but we don't have a seat at the table, and that hurts. In every area of our life, it hurts to be left out. Whether it's in a group of friends and, you're the awkward third wheel and the other two like each other a little more than they like you and you're never picked quite first, or whether it's plans with friends and everybody's going out to eat, but they forget to invite you, and so you find out about it later when you see the pictures up online and hear the stories. Sometimes we don't have a seat at the table. Sometimes it's at the office, and we get told that we're the most expendable piece. Sometimes it's when our family breaks apart, and there's no longer a seat for us at the table. Now, as humans, we long for community. And we're designed that way, we evolved this way, we exist this way, to be around other people. And so even those of us who like to have a little more introvert time, even those of us that don't love to be around people all the time, still want to know that if we want it and when we're ready for it, there's a place for us at the table. There's pain when we don't have space at the table. Now, one of the most famous scenes and one of the most beloved scenes in Jesus' life takes place at just such a table. We call it the Last Supper, and here's a painting of it that's actually our sermon promo graphic. It's this moment of extreme holiness, this moment that we remember in the Gospels. Da Vinci painted this version of the Last Supper at a convent in Italy. It's actually a massive painting. It takes up an entire wall in their dining room, and it overlooks them as they eat this Last Supper. It's this long, long, massive table. Their table can fit 13 people on one side of the table. Our table at home wasn't quite that big, but we can use both sides, so it works a little better. But this was a big table. Now, for Jesus and his friends, as they gather around this table, this was a special moment. This wasn't just a normal meal. This was a holiday meal. What we call the Last Supper or communion, for them, they would have called Passover. Passover was the time that the ancient Hebrew people and our modern Jewish friends still celebrate, where they would remember what had happened to their people. They would remember that their ancestors had been slaves in Egypt, and they would remember God bringing freedom and hope to them. They would remember the pain of slavery, and so they would eat these things that would help them experience that pain. They would eat bitter herbs dipped in salts to taste the tears of their forefathers. They would celebrate the rushed flight of their people from slavery by eating this bread that hadn't quite had time to rise. We call it matzah bread. They would eat this symbolically to remember how fast their ancestors had had to run into the desert. This was a meal for Jesus and his disciples that was just pregnant with meaning, with symbolism. Passover was the holiday where they would get together and they would remember that once upon a time their people had been slaves, but that God had looked at them and said, I don't think that's my will for you. And they were able to celebrate now because God had brought them to a place of hope and freedom. That was the message of Passover as Jesus and his disciples gathered around a table. Now, one of the reasons I love this painting of the table is the way it's painted. It's almost like we're invited to pull up a seat at the table. And the way we read the scripture is almost like we're invited to imagine ourselves having a place at the table. And their holiday gathering looked a little bit like our holiday gatherings. And I mean that in the sense that for most of us, our holiday gatherings from far enough back look really calm. They look really beautiful. They look like they belong on a greeting card, but I don't know about you, but my holiday gatherings, sometimes when we get closer, sometimes we argue, and sometimes we talk, and sometimes we get messy. And so at this holiday table, there's people arguing about politics and religion, and they're bringing up all those conversations that you're not supposed to bring up, especially at holiday dinners. They've got people arguing about who's better, and so two brothers are going back and forth about I'm the best, and you're not the best, and finally Jesus has to cut in on James and John and say, guys, we're done here. Neither of you are the best. Some of you have had to say that at holiday dinners. It's got a guy who's kind of oversharing a little bit about the details of the meal. If you've ever had a kid who decides to make sure everybody vividly knows exactly what happened to make the food appear on the plate, it's got this at this meal. It's got an overworked host. And so even though Jesus is like the guy presiding over this banquet, nobody shows up to do the basic cleaning, and so Jesus has to get down on his hands and knees and wash people's gross and dirty feet. If you've ever been in charge of Thanksgiving dinner and you get up at 3 a.m. and you prep the turkey and the ham, and by the time the meal comes, you just want to sleep, but instead you notice that the dog got let in and it's tracked muddy footprints all over the house, and you get to clean those up too. If you've ever been that host, this is your story. It's got some weird characters. It's got the crazy guy who decides that this is the best time to show off his latest purchases from the gun show. I love this passage in Luke 22:38. Some guys come to Jesus and they go up to Jesus and say, hey, Lord, look, here are 2 swords. And Jesus has to cut in and say, guys, enough of that. Like, if you've ever had to make a no firearms at the table policy, this is your story. Some of you have crazy cousin Eddie in your family. Some of you don't. I can tell by how much you joke. It's a story that's got betrayal. Judas is sitting at this table passing rolls and butter to people that he's going to set up to be killed. And if you've ever sat around a table with someone who's betrayed you, this is your story. It's got an angry departure. The meal's not even over when Judas storms out. And so if you've ever been at a meal and something is said or something is done and it just sets you off and you can't take anymore and you're gone, this is your story. See, 2,000 years ago, a man named Jesus sat down at a meal called Passover to talk about God's hope and freedom. And to do so, he prepared a table for all sorts of different people who shouldn't have been there. For sinners and complainers, for betrayers and whiners, and for just normal people who were hoping that somewhere out there they might find freedom. And they sat down to remember that this is what God's all about. When I think about where this story lines up with our world, I think that many of us know how these disciples must have felt. That we're longing that somewhere out there might be a place that we can experience that same hope and freedom from God. That we look at the places in our lives where it feels like we're trapped in slavery. Lent's the time that many people choose to give up things that they've been doing and for 40 days to fast from them. Some of you will be giving up chocolate or caffeine. I don't know how people give up caffeine in Lent. That's the time that pastors double their caffeine. But people choose to give up things to which they are entangled or addicted. This is the time that we prepare and remember God's freedom. It's also the time that we look ahead with hope. We prepare on Easter Sunday for the day that we celebrate that life trumps even death. That resurrection's bigger than the grave. That we look ahead towards hope. This is the time for many of us that we're longing for that same hope and freedom which these disciples are gathered to remember and celebrate. It's a beautiful scene, and in some ways it's our scene. But here's the thing about this scene. For this to take place, some stuff's got to happen. See, Jesus is setting a place at the table for his disciples, but the reality is it's not actually even Jesus' table. Some of you know this. Jesus is from Galilee. He doesn't have a home in Jerusalem, which is where the story takes place. So for this to be a table open to other people, someone's got to open up their table to Jesus. Now, the good news is that somewhere in Jerusalem, there's a room set aside for them. Somewhere in Jerusalem, a family has taken the pains to set a table for Jesus and his disciples, to prepare a place where they can remember Passover and this message of hope and freedom. We call it the upper room, and it's a famous and important room in our story. But the thing is, Jesus and his disciples don't know where to find it. Jesus sends his disciples into Jerusalem to prepare the Passover, but instead of telling them, go to John's house or go to this address, he tells them, go to the city gates, and there's a guy that's going to meet you and show you where to go. Because they know that somewhere in the city is a place prepared for them. Somewhere in this city is a place where they can experience hope and freedom. They just don't know where it is. Sometimes we experience that, don't we? And that's where this minor character comes into play. He doesn't even have a name. We just know him as the unnamed water carrier. He's probably a servant, maybe even a slave, in the house of a wealthy family. And he meets these two disciples at the city gate. And he sees that they're looking and longing for a place of hope and freedom, a place to celebrate the Passover meal. And he leads them to one. He's such a small detail, it's easy to miss over him. It's easy to think that this is just logistics or just something unimportant. But I think it's here for a reason. See, he seems so insignificant, but without him, all of this falls apart. It's not enough for the owner of this large house to prepare a place for the disciples and for Jesus to celebrate communion. It's not enough for this man to set a table and to put seats around it for Jesus and his disciples to celebrate God's hope and freedom, to celebrate Passover. The owner could have done all of those things, and the disciples still would have missed it. This unnamed water carrier, this slave, is here to remind us that we need someone to guide us. That even though that hope and freedom exists somewhere out there, that we still need someone to bring us to it. When we confirmed our kids, we had them come forward with their families and also with somebody who's been acting as a mentor to them, whose job was to guide them to the places in Scripture and to the understandings of our faith that God brings hope and freedom to each of us. And so as we prayed over them in confirmation, their families gathered around and prayed on them as well, that we might continue to guide them to a place of God's hope and freedom. Because of this unnamed guy who's willing to guide people from the city gate, from where they're looking for hope, looking for a place at a table, to that upper room, we have a place at the table. Because of this unnamed guy, Jesus and his disciples are able to sit around a table like this and celebrate a meal like that, and we have some of the most important teachings in our Bible. Because of this unnamed guy, we are welcome. And that has implications for us. See, I think as a church, we do an awesome job at preparing a place for people at the table. I hope when you walked in here today that someone greeted you and said, "We're happy you're here," and I believe they meant it. I hope that you knew that there was coffee for you and snacks for you, and that you knew that you have a place, no matter where you're coming from, at this table. But we also know that there's people in our world who are longing for that message of hope and freedom, but don't know where to find the upper room. We know that there are people in our world who are wandering at the city gate looking for someone with an invite. People who need a message of hope. And so we're going to spend the next 6 weeks around this table, and we're going to talk about that message. We're going to spend the next 6 weeks talking about the different things that we find on the communion table, the cup and the plate, the candles, the basin, and the towels. We're going to talk about what they mean to us and what they symbolize and the hope they bring to us, but we're also going to talk about the hope they bring to the world. Because we believe that we have a place at the table, but also that there are seats yet to be occupied. There are people still at the city gates looking for a guide to bring them to the place where they could be part of the table. Now, the good news is we can do this. As a church, we are equipped to bring people and to guide them to the upper room and to the table. A few weeks ago, Nancy and Mike Henry grabbed me in the hallway, and they wanted to talk. They said, "Hey, we got a proposal we want to run by you. How do you feel about us starting a new Boy Scout troop?" And I was confused at first because not only do we already have a Boy Scout troop here at the church, but Mike and Nancy are the leaders of it. And so I was a little confused, like, what happened to the last one? And we started talking to go, no, that one's still doing great. But here's the thing. Last year, there was a troop in Wyandotte County that closed down, and we want to make a troop for those kids too. And I thought, well, that's great, but why don't they just join our existing troop? I said, no, here's the thing about that troop in Wyandotte County. It was a troop for special needs Boy Scouts, and it was the only one of its type. It was a troop designed to take care of accessibility and ability issues. It was a troop designed to make sure that kids who might not otherwise be able to be part of Boy Scouts would have a place at the table. It was a troop for kids that have a lot of things they struggle with, and for their families to know that they are welcomed and cared for. See, for some of these young people, even sensory overload, even a group this big would be tough for them. It would be just hard for these kids and their families. And so this troop had been their table. But when it closed down last year, they had nothing. And so Mike and Nancy wanted to create a place for these kids. And so they said, how do you feel about it? And it was one of those like, well, if you have a pastor that ever turns that down, you should get a new pastor. And so they worked with our trustees team, and they got rooms reserved and did everything. And then they started to reach out to these families and say, hey, no pressure, but we've got a place for you, and you're welcome here. And Mike and Nancy went out and grabbed people and began to bring them here. And yesterday at 2 o'clock in the basement in Hughes Hall, they had the first meeting of Troop 0537. This is the only special needs Boy Scout troop in Leavenworth or Wyandotte counties. And that's something that I don't say to build us up, but I say because that's what it looks like, not just to build a place at the table, but to go to the city gates, to where there are people looking and longing and hoping for a message of freedom and hope. Longing for this Passover meal, longing for a place where people will say, hey, come on, we're going to do whatever it takes. We're going to turn the table sideways. We're going to grab extra chairs. I don't care if somebody's sitting in a recliner. We're going to make this work so that you have a place at the table.